The oldest and strongest human emotion is fear. And the oldest and strongest type of fear is trepidation of the unknown. When we were children, our parents told us that monsters didn't exist. But we were sure that something was lurking under the bed or in the closet. Fear sees, even if our eyes are closed. Welcome to the realm of the arcane. My name is Lon Strickler. Join me as I examine unexplained creatures, strange manifestations, and remarkable realities. Imagine this next hour as a voyage of discovery to strange lands, seeking not for new territory, but for new knowledge of the supernatural. Come on board as we begin this adventure together. Hey folks, good evening and welcome to another episode of Arcane Radio. I'm your host, Lon Strickler, and I thank you for joining me here on the Paranormal King Radio Network. Now, before I introduce my guest, I want to mention an account I recently received. The following account is a strange experience that occurred to my mother at the age of 5, along with her family in the winter of 1957. The incident was the picking up of hitchhikers that may or may not have been human. The incident bears some similarities with accounts of phantom hitchhikers, but goes much further to suggest that they were real flesh and bone beings. Now, my mother and her family, which consisted of her parents and older sister, lived between the cities of Reidsville and Greensboro in North Carolina. One day, they had an errand in Reidsville, and on their way, they saw an older couple walking on the opposite side of the road. A couple of hours later, leaving Reidsville on their way home, they saw the same couple in the same spot heading in the same direction as before, almost as if they had been walking on a treadmill, having gained no ground at all. They pulled up and asked if they needed a lift, and they said they were trying to get to Greensboro to the bus station. And my grandfather agreed to take them there, but first they would have to go home to be there in time to pick up their oldest daughter from the school bus near their home. Now, once inside the car, it became painfully obvious that they were poorly dressed for the icy cold weather. My mother was wearing the woman was wearing a summer dress and sandals, and the man a shirt and bib overalls and shoes along with a brimmed hat. My mother, being a small child, sat between her parents in the front seat, but turned around facing the couple, staring at the strangers as children do, taking in their appearance. The one thing that stood out in her mind was the man's piercing, beautiful blue eyes. The man reached into his pocket and handed her a red pencil with Coca-Cola written on it. When they reached home, it was decided that they would stay for lunch and that their names were Bradley. Now, before the drive back to Greensboro. Now, considering their clothing, my grandmother decided to give them more appropriate winter clothing and coats and shoes for the woman who had only sandals. Grandmother also decided to pack them snacks and sandwiches for the trip. Now, with their guests well fed and with warmer clothes and snacks, everyone piled back into the car to take them back to Greensboro. Now, halfway on their trip, the Bradleys insisted that they needed to be left off on the bridge on Old U.S. Highway 29. My grandfather protested, saying that they would likely not get another ride, and being winter, it would be getting dark soon, and insisted on carrying them all the way. But they said no, they must be left off on the bridge. A sort of back and forth occurred between the grandfather and the Bradleys, with them asking to please be left off the bridge. Unable to change their minds, he obliged and stopped the car. They opened the door and got out and immediately disappeared, leaving the door still open. My grandfather was horrified, jumping out of the car, looking to see if they had fell down on the ice out of his view, but they were nowhere to be found. He looked all about and called for them, but nothing but silence. The whole area was clear as far as he could see, but still nothing. He got back in the car with his family, severely upset and confused as to what happened, as was everybody else. Frantically, they drove up and down the road looking for them, wondering if there's somehow they had gotten another ride, trying to rationalize the obvious and spectacular disappearance of the Bradleys. After a fruitless search, they drove back home confused as if what had just occurred. This made a huge impression on my mother, having distinctly remembered the incident all of her life. So the question remains, who were the Bradleys? Were they ghosts? But ghosts don't stay all afternoon with you to eat lunch. Furthermore, when they disappeared, the clothes given to them disappeared as well, even the sandwiches that were packed for them. This suggests that they were solid beings. Also, why did he insist on being left off the bridge, saying it must be done? Was it some sort of portal or gateway to their home? The whole thing remains a mystery. So let's get started with tonight's show. Tonight's guest is Nick Redfern, who is an author, cryptozoologist, and ufologist. Nick is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracies, alien abductions, and paranormal phenomena. Nick works on the lecture circuit both in the UK and overseas, and has appeared in internationally syndicated shows discussing the UFO phenomenon. His most recent title is Top Secret Alien Abduction Files, What the Government Doesn't Want You to Know. So, Nick, it's always great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Lon. How's it going?
Going pretty good. You know, I hear you've now written 50 books. Is that true?
Well, it is, but I mean, it's it is, but it's sort of 2 books a year, and I've been doing it for like 25 years. So if you look at it like that, 2 books a year isn't that difficult to do, and if you do it kind of regularly over 25 years, you know, it soon racks up, I guess.
But, you know, all these years I've been talking to you, I never asked you, how did you ever get started researching and writing about the strange and unexplained?
Well, I'm one of these people who hasn't really had what I could call a UFO encounter. You know, I've never seen a lake monster. I've never, you know, been running around in the woods in Pacific Northwest and, you know, running into Bigfoot. But what got me interested is that my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He was a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several UFO incidents at the height of the Cold War, when, you know, the Russians were still the big threat, and they still are. But the story, basically what it was during a NATO exercise called Main Brace, and the radar operators at the base where my dad was stationed, which was called Royal Air Force Neatishead on the east coast of England, they tracked these high-flying, fast-moving objects, and the first thought was, well, it's got to be the Russians, and so they scrambled fighter planes to try and intercept them. When the pilots got close, some of them described seeing these bright lights. Other pilots reported seeing what looked like sort of classic flying saucers. And this went on over the course of 3 nights, where the planes were just simply unable to catch up with them and had to return to base when they were running low on fuel. Now, at the end of the 3rd night, that was the end of all the encounters, and everybody who was involved, the pilots, the ground crew, the radar operators, and the radar mechanics, like my dad, who was brought in to check out the equipment to make sure it wasn't faulty. Everybody was told, you know, you won't talk about this, etc., etc. And my dad didn't say anything till I was about 11 or 12, and he told me the story, and that sort of really got me interested, not because it was my own dad, but because he also had a background in the military on radar. And so I started reading books like people by like John Keel, Brad Steiger, people like that. And I sort of took it from there. And when I finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I wasn't that particularly good, you know, a student at school. And you know, I didn't really do any good at school. I ended up walking out. That was my beginning to the real world, the big world, so to speak. And I just didn't enjoy it, and I just didn't see the point of learning about physics and biology and chemistry and algebra, because I knew when I left school I would never need to know about any of that stuff ever again, you know. So I didn't know what to do, and actually stumbled, luckily, on a job, as fate would have it, in the little town I was living at the time, where there was a job offering for somebody straight out of school to work on a celebrity gossip entertainment magazine, and they would train you from the base up, if you like. And I said I wasn't that much good at school, but I did enjoy reading. I love books, and so I worked on that magazine for a couple of years, and it closed down. And then I thought, well, why not try and combine the background that I developed in writing, in journalism on the magazine, but apply those sort of journalistic techniques to the interest that I developed in the paranormal. So that's how it all kind of sort of developed, really. It was just fate and being in the right place at the right time, and just deciding what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do, really.
Mm. It's kind of interesting hearing that your father had a UFO background. My dad was in the service as well. He was in the U.S. Air Force, and I had always been interested in the paranormal and the strange things, and but I had never known until I found out from him later on that he was actually with the 509th Bomber Wing. Of course, that's
Roswell.
That's Roswell. Now, of course, they were gone from Roswell by the time he was in. They were actually at Hunter Air Force Base in Savannah, Georgia by then. But he had heard quite a few stories because he went in 1952, so there were still a lot of guys that were in the unit. And in fact, Tibbetts was his commander. So at that time, that was very strange. So yeah, I got a few stories out of that. Quite honest with you, I believe there something really did happen in Roswell from the stories that I received over the years from these guys.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because my dad's encounter was also 1952. It was a NATO exercise. The NATO exercise was called Main Brace, and if you Google NATO Main Brace UFO, you'll find a lot of stories. Even in the official files, which have now been declassified, there actually was a large wave of UFO activity at that time, but some of the records have now been declassified at the British National Archives, so they've opened up a little bit. But when I was given that story when I was about 11 or 12, the files were still under wraps then. So at least part of the story's coming out, which is better than nothing.
Mm. Yeah, he was part of the Strategic Air Command at that time, and he was a bomber engineer. So he heard a lot of flight stories, and these guys were seeing all kinds of stuff up there because they were real high altitude, and they had a lot of encounters you never hear about.
Mm-hmm.
So your most recent book is The Top Secret Alien Abduction Files: What the Government Doesn't Want You to Know. So what do the governments really know about alien abductions?
Well, that's a good question. Now, I mean, whenever I'm sort of thinking about writing a book, I always sort of put myself in the perspective of a reader, because as well as writing books, I read them as well. And so I always try and come up with something new, or at least a new angle, even if it's an old topic, at least a new angle on something.
Right.
And, writing a lot of books and articles, you get a lot of feedback, and people want to share stories. And over the years, I collected a lot of accounts from people who had got an interest in the UFO subject, not just because of their own experiences, but also family members. And in some cases, they were talking about the abduction phenomenon, family members who'd been abducted, or the person contacted me had been abducted. And in not a lot of cases to start with, but a few cases, the witnesses said that on various occasions, only 2 or 3 occasions, they were visited by military personnel, not in sort of a sinister or threatening fashion, but just more in the situation of, we saw the article you wrote about your experience. Would you mind if we come in and talk to you about it? It was actually quite a relaxed kind of situation. And, if it was just one case, I'd Oh, okay. Well, that's just interesting but weird. But over the years, I've probably got somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 cases now of people who were sort of quietly and to a degree clandestinely visited. And a lot of them were people in the UFO field who'd had the abduction experience and who had been visited. And it made me realize that there was this trend developing of what sounded like a small but sort of deeply hidden funded group within the government, which seems to have a deep interest in the abduction phenomenon and has basically sort of covered all areas to try and figure out what's going on. And as you might imagine, a lot of their data came from the UFO community itself, which today, with social media and the internet, it's very easy, just to see what this researcher or that researcher is doing right now and what their latest information they've got, which was a lot, much more difficult decades ago when there was no internet. But there's no doubt in my mind at all that deep within the military or in the intelligence community, there is this small group that is sort of deeply concerned about the abduction phenomenon and has sort of taken a proactive but careful and stealthy approach to people who've had the experiences and interviewed them. I won't say interrogated them, because for the most part it wasn't anything like that. It was, just question and answers, because it seems the government is interested but concerned and doesn't really seem to have much of a bigger picture than we do, only that they're not entirely sure that it's benevolent.
So what type of contactees interest the government? And how do these officials react to these experiencers?
Well, I mean, in terms of how the questioning began, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
How do these interviews occur? Well,
yeah.
One of the things that I've noted is that for the vast majority of the cases where there's been a government angle to it, although it hasn't been something that occurred on a massive scale in the 50s, 60s and 70s, I have got probably about 7 or 8 to 10 cases from that period, from that era. But the vast majority do come from the last 15 to 20 years. And the reason why I think that is because, particularly if you look at things today like Twitter, Facebook, blogging, etc., what you find is that a lot of these accounts, people just put their own stories online. So in other words, the days of the government having to carefully follow people around and, survey telephones, that kind of thing, those days are largely gone. All you have to do to see what the average UFO researcher is doing and the latest cases they found is to go to their Facebook page, and see what they're saying about the story. And that seems to be the way how the government has worked with this. It's actually nothing hugely conspiratorial and following people around or listening on the phone or anything like that. It's just looking at the stories, the latest information, and if there's something that really catches their attention, on occasion they've gone out and quietly and carefully spoken to the witnesses. We saw your account. Would you mind sharing it with us? We're looking into this. We'd prefer you don't go public with this interview because we feel there could be national security issues, that kind of thing. And if it really was like something, thousands of people running this, sort of the equivalent of the FBI or the CIA, but just on alien abductions, I would be extremely skeptical of something like that, because it would clearly have tumbled out into the public domain by now. But a small group of perhaps 15 to 20 personnel, carefully and sort of stealthily funded and keeping a careful eye on every aspect of the abduction phenomenon, reviewing books and articles, and on occasion going out and speaking to people if they feel some of the stories are very significant. That seems to be the way they're doing it, and to me that would explain, I think, why the story hasn't largely come out, because it's not some huge organization. It's actually quite a small one. But there were some disturbing trends to the cases that the government investigated. And I found this when I was interviewing and tracking down the people, what I found was a trend that one of the areas that the government asked the abductees about was that when you were having the abduction experience, did you feel at any point that and this is going to sound really weird, but the question they asked you, did you feel at any point that like your soul had been extracted out of your body? Now, some people might say, well, that's, the agents actually sort of leading them down a path, rather than just getting their story. But that was a question they asked quite a lot. Did you feel like your soul was being extracted? Did you have what you felt was like a near-death experience? Did you see yourself on the UFO like from above, looking down at your body on the table with the so-called little greys around it? And that was one of the areas that I found with these people who've been visited. That was one of the areas that they were focused on time and time again, connections between abductees and what you might call the soul and life after death. And they were also asked about dreams and nightmares, not of, sort of involved, not necessarily always involving aliens, but, did they have any nightmares and bad dreams of like nuclear war and images of gigantic mushroom clouds and all that kind of thing. So a lot of what the government was looking at was sort of apocalyptic stuff in relation to abductions and matters relative to life after death, which kind of suggests that the government, or an agency, a small group within government, I should say, it seems that, now you can find stories like this, in a lot of abduction books. People have these apocalyptic dreams. But it seems to me that the government has gone further than just, speaking to people about their experiences. Were you implanted? What did you see on board the craft? They've gone far beyond that now, and it seems they're more, for whatever reason, whether they got more data, but they seem to be focusing more on the far more alternative aspects of the abduction phenomenon, going far beyond just nuts and bolts craft and, genetic experiments and implants. They're going almost down like an esoteric, like a supernatural path. They seem to be more interested in the supernatural aspects of, as I said, things like prophetic dreams and nightmares and the soul and stuff like that.
Well, this brings me to another question, and I was intrigued from what you wrote in the book about these dream scenarios, especially the ones you received from many people during the Chicago winged humanoid sightings. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. Well, what happened was, as you obviously know, like 2017, there was this huge wave of Mothman type activity in and around the Chicago area, and it caused, it provoked a lot of interest on the part of cryptozoologists and ufologists, because, the whole Mothman thing kind of straddles both domains, ufology and cryptozoology. And for a lot of people, it's perceived as like a supernatural creature. So you have, various different angles to this. Now, although I didn't ever sort of go out of my way at all to write any articles, particularly on the Chicago Mothman sightings, but what I did, I mentioned that in an article in that same time frame that I'd received a number of sort of accounts and stories from abductees who, in that period, had apocalyptic dreams. And I actually wrote this article because I'd already started to get some of these abductee stories in. So I thought I'd put an article out there, which I did at Mysterious Universe, and to see if I would bring any other people forward. And I was amazed at how many people did come forward. I think in the first week there was like 27 people who said they'd had apocalyptic dreams within the past, sort of about the last 3 or 4 weeks. And I think out of that 27, 5 or 6 were based around Chicago. And I think now the number of these apocalyptic dream stories of cities around the US is somewhere in the region of about 60 to 65, I think it is now. And the witnesses were basically all telling the same story, and this also kind of tied in time-wise when you had all the fears that North Korea was going to be able to develop a nuclear weapon, and there were in the news they were saying it might be able to reach Seattle or it might be able to reach Chicago. So kind of like with the Mothman in Point Pleasant in the 60s, which ended in tragedy with the collapse of the Silver Bridge, you had Mothman turning up in Chicago, where people were associating Chicago with nightmarish dreams and nuclear attacks, that kind of thing. So I wrote that first article, and that actually provoked, even the second one I wrote, provoked even more responses. Again, people seeing images of cities just flattened in seconds and millions of people dead and the sky like black for years. Now, one person contacted me to say, did I read Whitley Strieber's novel, War Day? Now, for people who don't know that book, it was written in 1984, 3 years before Strieber's first abduction book came out, Communion. This was back in 1984. And War Day, it's a novel, but it actually places Strieber and his family in the story. It's basically a fictionalized version of how they reacted or survived a nuclear war. And what's particularly interesting is that in War Day, bear in mind that this was, 1984, in the story, there are rumors of this huge flying humanoid creature with bat-like wings flying around the landscape after the nuclear attack. Now, what's also intriguing is that a number of people who had these prophetic dreams said that the US was placed in like a vulnerable position because before the nuclear attacks occurred, that the country was hit with basically what's called electromagnetic, I've forgotten the term, electromagnetic pulse.
Right.
It's called an EMP, it's electromagnetic pulse weapon, which basically will render just about every piece of electrical equipment in not just the immediate vicinity, but for literally dozens and hundreds of miles. And strategically placed EMP weapons can literally, disable a country. And a number of the people who had these dreams of sort of nuclear war and atomic destruction and so on, in those dreams, they were seeing imagery where we were unable to fight back, and they couldn't figure out how that could be the case. And it turned out that when they looked up, on the internet as to how that could be, it all came back to EMP weapons, which, again, if you launch EMP weapons, as I said, at one particular location, it will literally render everything, electrical systems, cars, internet, everything will go out, and you have no way really to do anything about it. So, there were all these different threads coming from different people, but they were all interlinked, and it all revolved around disasters, nuclear explosions, nightmares and dreams of the future, but also EMP weapons, and in several cases, sort of like that I received, I didn't receive a lot, but I think I got 3 or 4 cases where somebody dreamed of like a large winged creature. And then, of course, there was one that I totally overlooked, and that was the War Day book of Whitley Strieber, which contains, as I said, a saga of a Mothman-type creature. And it just so happens that in War Day, the reason why the US comes across after the war in just a state of total disaster and collapse is because the Russians launch an EMP weapon, or a series of them, which disables the entire electric grid in the US, so we're unable to launch back. So you put all those issues together, and it really did come across sort of like really eerie,
It's interesting because I'd say in July and August, well, when I was, during the middle of this flap in Chicago, I was receiving phone calls up to 20 a day, really, for 24 hours, any time at night from residents in Chicago who were scared to death that something was going to happen because of these sightings. And I'd also get these dream scenarios of nuclear disaster. But I never really thought much about it. I just thought, well, I don't know, and quite frankly, when I read this in your book, I was kind of shocked because I hadn't heard that before.
Well,
It
yeah, I
was.
mean, it's one of the. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, I guess it's one of those things that a lot of people don't necessarily associate with abductions, because what I mean by that is a lot of the people who approach me with these stories of like futuristic nightmares of an atomic war, a lot of them, there was no UFO component or even an abduction component to it. But in some cases there was, where the witnesses or the people having the dreams were abductees, and they were seeing sort of mass destruction here, there, and everywhere across the country. And from there, some of those abductees said that they were sort of approached, again, quite sort of clandestinely by government security people who said, we saw this. Again, this gets back to what I said about social media. One of the people I spoke to said, she posted something on her Facebook page about, her fears that, we could be hit by EMP weapons and then we'd be disabled. And she got a visit and said, can you tell us more as to why you think this? Could we read your story? And again, it was not, it was not an interrogation or anything threatening. It was just, somebody who was ordered to go out essentially and look into the story.
Mm-hmm.
And since the book's come out, 3 other people have contacted me to say that they had similar experiences, which again leads me to believe that this angle of like Armageddon and death and nuclear war and the soul and the afterlife, somebody for some reason on the inside is really kind of antsy and concerned about that angle. It doesn't even seem to be that the abduction angle per se, just the issue of people being abducted. That doesn't seem to be the primary thing, nor do all these rumors and concerns about implants and tracking people and all that kind of stuff. It really does seem to be far more connected to this this weirder side, and far more, in many respects, like a far more disturbing side.
Mm. That's interesting because I have been visited by government officials on 2 occasions. And on both occasions, they were inquiring about something I wrote that referenced an encounter, an alien encounter, supposedly, that had come through portals.
Mm.
Both instances, they asked about that. And I never really thought much about it, though. It kind of shook me up. But they were interested. I just didn't know that it was so widespread.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. And I think the only reason why I've been able to sort of develop kind of the sheer scope and scale that this is going on is because, it's like you write a book on any subject or an article on it, whether it's Bigfoot or UFOs or Mothman, Men in Black, whatever. What happens very often is that people will contact you and say, hey, Nick, I read your article, read your book. I wanted to share this with you because it was similar to my experience of A, B, C, X, Y, Z. So, in other words, I think that's the only reason I was able to start putting this picture together, because people were sort of generously enough to share their experience. And then you start to develop this picture and this pattern. I mean, I think that would be arguably pretty much exactly the same, with your cases in relation to Mothman last year, that 1 or 2 stories get to you, you put the story out there, and other people who've had the experience, they put their story out there or send it to you, and it develops. And it was kind of like a similar thing. You got dozens and dozens of Mothman cases. I didn't get dozens and dozens of Mothman cases from Chicago at all. In fact, just one or two. But what I did was a lot of these prophetic dream ones, because that's what I was writing the articles about at Mysterious Universe. So I think that, more than anything else, is the way in which we're starting to see this bigger picture, is because, as I said, the witnesses, the victims, however you want to term them, they're the ones who are willing to, either on the record or off the record, share their accounts, and then you can start to build up this picture. And as I said, the picture is not what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was just going to be, where do the aliens come from? What are they? What do they want? No, it was all about, far more unsettling stuff, like, as I said, like the soul and the afterlife, and what do you think, the outcome's going to be for us, and just a lot of questions. The questions that were being asked made me, I have no proof of what I'm going to say now, but the questions that they asked, it seemed to me that they've been looking into some really alternative areas, literally studying, theories and concepts in relation to the whole issue of the soul and religion and fate and Armageddon and just things like that you wouldn't necessarily think they were being applying their time to, but they actually were.
And that's interesting, because I would never think that a government agency would kind of be open-minded to a lot of this.
Well, I mean, I'll give you another perfect example of this, and this one's actually documentable. Is that, you remember back in January '86 when the space shuttle Challenger exploded on takeoff, the crew all got killed? Well, when that happened, a number of people contacted the FBI and claimed that they'd seen, like, as if something had hit the fuel tank and exploded it. So they were talking about, like, terrorists and things like that.
Right.
And five or six people contacted the FBI, and the FBI came out to interview these people. What did you see, etc., etc. One of them was a psychic woman, and the reason I'm mentioning this is because the space shuttle file, has now been declassified by the FBI, and you can read it at their website, The Vault. And in one case, one of the witnesses was a psychic, and they actually went out to interview this woman and took the story very seriously. They said, well, what were you told? What were they? She said she was in contact with these strange entities, sort of ethereal entities. She never actually called them aliens, but that was, for all intents and purposes, what they were. And the FBI listened very carefully, and that became part of the FBI file. So, in other words, government agencies, don't necessarily investigate UFO encounters or deal with psychics because they have, like, the Psychic Project. It's not like that. Will basically follow up on any and all leads to figure out what they need to figure out to preserve national security. And sometimes they will go down very alternative pathways to try and find the answers. And it doesn't necessarily mean they believe that this is the answer, but they feel that they have to cover, every angle. I mean, that's like why in the 1970s, you had the psychic ESP phenomena known as remote viewing, where, the government tried to psychically sort of spy on the Russians. Now, if you look at the declassified files, there are a lot of people in government who thought, wow, this is actually going to work. And other people were like, this is crazy, we shouldn't be funding this. So, in other words, you do have this situation where very often funding is given to government agencies where sometimes even the agencies themselves are dubious as to whether or not they should even be looking into this, or should they be looking elsewhere. And I think that's probably the case with what was going on in 2017, that there were a lot of people coming forward with these nightmarish dreams, and some of them connected with abductions. And somebody said, well, regardless of how wild this sounds, because they're talking about EMP weapons and things like this, we really ought to just check into it just to be safe, because that's what they've always done. They did it with remote viewing and with the space shuttle, etc. So I think that's what's going on now. There may well be people in government who are thinking, we should not be spending even a penny, just a dime on this. And other people think, well, the 70, 80 people are talking about this, and they're very specific in terms of the locations. It won't hurt to funnel, 50 grand into, having 5 guys look into this for like 6 weeks or 2 months, and at the end of it, let's see what we've got. I think that's probably, the approach that was taken, something like that.
Do you think these government agencies that you're talking about now, is that connected to what the old phenomena with the Men in Black, or is this something entirely different?
Oh, well, that actually gets into one of the weirdest parts of the book, actually. Now, most of the people who I spoke to said, there was concern on the part of the interviewees, the interviewers within the government, who said, we really don't want you to talk about this, or at least not for a while. But we just want, to see if you can help us. And they did. But when you talk about the Men in Black, a lot of people take the image of, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones from the movies. But if you look at the original reports of the MIB, going back to the 50s and to the present day, you get a lot of reports where they just don't even look human. They look very, very pale and gaunt and skinny, and sometimes have these large eyes that they hide behind these wraparound glasses. And they seem to have the ability to sort of control people's minds and hypnotize them. So, they don't come across as human. Now, to get back to what you said about the Men in Black, there are a number of cases that I've got where the people who were visited by the government agents and were interviewed in quite it wasn't really, like an intimidating situation for the most part. I was just, can you help us? But probably about 20% of those people I interviewed said they had sort of follow-up situations where they'd get home from work and they'd see this strange guy standing over the other side of the street with like an old black suit and an old black fedora hat and looking really weird and just staring into the window. And other people describe similar things where they would see these MIB following them, but they didn't seem like in the movies. They seemed more like sort of cadaverous vampires, was how one person actually described them, looking like a vampire. So it seems to be the case, and this is where it gets really complicated, is that there are people in government who've been interviewing clandestinely and quietly the abductees, and then afterwards you've got this creepier group of the Men in Black also keeping their eyes on the very same abductees. So it's like you've got, the government angle and this weird MIB angle that nobody really, I don't think, has fully figured out what they are, except there's no way they're from the Pentagon or the DOD. They're not, there's something much weirder. But and maybe that too has sort of, pushed the government to look into this angle as well. Again, I'm speculating there, but it is kind of strange, when you find that you've got the abductees being interviewed by the government and then followed by these other groups of people as well. And so I'm sure there's a much bigger picture that we're still really trying to figure out what's going on and put all the pieces together, because right now, and unfortunately, even I have to admit, I think we've still got like strands of these stories, but at least we're starting to see things come together.
Well, I tell you, I've worked with several supposed abductees over the years, but there are a few things of this whole phenomenon that just really bother me, and in particular, like the MyLab intimidation that accompanies an alien abduction, where somebody has had an actual alien abduction, and then a military the military either abducts them or really intimidates them.
Yeah.
Mind control of these same abductees, and then the possibility that an abductee will never return. Now, I've had one in particular, one abductee who had a lot of insight on this, that actually saw this where bodies were being disposed of by these non-terrestrial beings. So, I mean, why is the government involved? In particular, like this My Lab, you talk about Dulce or another facility. What's the deal with that?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting angle, and I sort of make a parallel between these two groups because they seem to be quite different. The MILABs that you're talking about, which stands for military abductions, people claim that they've been taken to sort of underground facilities and military bases by guys in sort of almost like a SWAT type outfit, like a black outfit and a black cap, and threatened and pushed around and intimidated quite deeply. And there's no doubt that that's part of the alien abduction history and law, so to speak. But there seems to be this other group within government that are clearly not the MILAB people. These are the ones I'm talking about that in relation to many of the cases in the book where, it really was just like a knock on the door and, hi, Mrs. Smith, we'd like to talk to you if you don't mind about your experience that you put on your Facebook page. And would you mind if we came in and talked to you? That's totally different to the MILAB angle, where people basically are pushed around. So, again, it's something I can't prove, but I think what it demonstrates is that there might be maybe even two, possibly even more groups within government that are looking into this abduction angle, but Agency A or Think Tank A isn't telling Think Tank B what they know, and somebody else thinks we should handle it like this, somebody else thinks we should handle it like that. So I think that's why we're seeing this really kind of large differentiation between the MILAB stories and what we would call these sort of far more, I wouldn't say laid back, but certainly non-threatening kind of
a kinder, gentler military, kind of gentler government.
I think the reason for this is because, when we say the government, it really is like a collective term for dozens of agencies, and within those dozens of agencies, there are small little projects that get funded here and funded there. So, in other words, it's not really the government that investigate abductions. It's a small think tank or a small project that has been funded by this group or that agency, and somebody else is funding another agency. But for security reasons, they don't necessarily always share information. And so for that reason, I think that probably explains, the distinct differences that you see, how some people are interviewed and others are sort of basically pulled around and threatened.
I ask researchers, especially in the UFO phenomena, how they deal with the government as far as when they put in a FOIA request. Do you have a lot of cooperation? Do you have any pushback, or what kind of problems do you face with them?
Well, I have to be honest. I mean, whenever I've used the Freedom of Information Act in the past, I've never had any problems. They've always said, this is what we can release to you, and this is what we cannot release to you. Mm-hmm. Now, what I found, the FBI are really good at declassifying their files. They have an online website called The Vault. If you just go to vault.gov, you will find literally millions of pages of files, of thousands of files on everything from celebrities to Russian spies to old-style gangster files, Bonnie and Clyde, that kind of thing. And what you find is that, the FBI has been really good at release of these files, and you can download them in PDF format. It doesn't cost you anything. So I found, but people often say, oh, they don't give you anything, they hold the best stuff back. But, I mean, you can go to the FBI's website, the Vault, go to the Unexplained Phenomenon section, click on that, that's what it's called. And then you've got like nearly 2,000 pages of really interesting UFO files that the FBI collected. There's like a 150-page file on there, reports on cattle mutilations, which are filled with reports of like black helicopters and cattle with organs removed and laser incisions. That's all in the FBI's declassified files. So they've actually been really good at declassifying documents. Now, of course, there are certain situations where national security overwhelms, just the public interest, and so very often files don't get declassified. And in many occasions, it's valid because you don't want our potential enemies to know, the extent to which our radar systems can,
Exactly.
can extend into the air, and we don't want them to find out, the power and etc. of our missiles and our artillery and so on. So, there are legitimate reasons why certain stuff should not be put in the public domain, because the public domain could mean your potential enemy. But when it comes to UFOs and things like that, I think, because the government's official stance has always been UFOs don't affect national security, my argument is, well, let's see everything then,
Right. Well, is now we do know that the government is interested in alien abductions, but with other phenomena, say Bigfoot, for instance. Now, we all heard the stories that the government was, interested in Bigfoot, and I had an experience many years ago where there seemed to be a lot of government interest in a sighting. But what's your feeling on that? Do you think it kind of the government is actually involved with the Bigfoot and other type of cryptozoology phenomena?
Well, I mean, this is where it gets into sort of really controversial situations. I mean, I don't personally have more than maybe one or two cases where, the witnesses claim that there was like a government connection to Bigfoot. But, I mean, I don't know if you know Stan Gordon in Pennsylvania.
Right.
Well, Stan is a friend of mine, and he wrote a book about 8 or 9 years ago called Silent Invasion, which was about a wave of UFO and Bigfoot activity in Pennsylvania in the mid-70s. And in there, Stan got a lot of really weird stories where military people came out and MIB people came out to investigate some of these weirder Bigfoot-type cases. There are one or two odd cases in the UK where there have been reports of what are known as alien big cats, or ABCs. They're like these huge black cats roaming around the UK, which should not be there. There's nothing like that should be natural to the UK. And there actually are a few weird stories where people who had reported to, say, their local police, that they'd seen this, something like a black jaguar roaming around the countryside. And then afterwards, the person received like weird phone calls telling them not to talk about it, or in a couple of cases, actually like an MIB knocking on the door and saying, please don't talk about this. Now that could be legitimately that, say that one particular arm of the government is a bit concerned about the possibility that there are large big cats possibly escaped or being released into the wild, and they just don't want people to know. But I have to say that that's very small handful that I have of these alien big cat stories in the MIB. They do actually sound more like MIB rather than concerned government civil servants who just don't want the public to panic. There does seem to be a more weirder aspect to it. Now, but other than that, I really don't have much of anything that sort of links the MIB directly to like cryptozoology. There are a couple of things, but not something where I could definitely say, there's like a solid big phenomenon,
Now, I want to get your thoughts on this. What are your thoughts on families' generational alien abduction. I mean, do you believe that it runs in families? Because I've heard stories where I've gotten a report from somebody and I talk to them about it, and invariably when I ask them, it turns out one of the parents or grandparents had a
Yeah.
similar type of phenomena. I mean, this is actually going on, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that's part of the phenomenon. Now, of course, the big question is, well, how can it happen? I mean, some researchers suggest this sort of ties in with the whole implant angle as to how they can track people,
Yeah.
around the country and follow, families on a generational level. I mean, you've seen the last few years, particularly in sort of conspiracy writing, the fears that people have about being implanted. We're all going to get implanted or whatever. But, I always say, not that this is actually gives us any help, but, if you look today, I always say to people, well, there's no need really for any of us to be implanted by the government because we really are already implanted. But it's called an iPhone, and instead of being implanted, it's in your pocket, and that iPhone will allow someone to track your every movement. It will
Yeah.
be able to essentially figure out what kind of books you buy off Amazon, what kind of clothing you like to buy online, what terms you look up on various search engines for this or that. So, in other words, the days of people worrying about implants, I actually think they're gone because, like as I said, the vast majority of people now do have iPhones, or at the very least a smartphone, if you haven't
Right.
got a literal iPhone. But what I would say is that because, it is so easy to monitor social media, there's no need for anyone to be implanted because we've already given up our privacy. And a lot of people just don't seem to care.
Yeah, you're right about that. Um, you wrote a book a while back about the RH negative factor in a lot of these alien
Oh, yeah.
abductees. And this is something I check with people when I talk to them. And I would say at least 80%, if not more, of the people that I talk to have O negative blood.
But
It almost every time it's O negative blood.
yeah, I mean, that's an interesting aspect of the phenomenon. And you're right, I did a book on that back in 2015,
Hmm.
um, excuse me, called Bloodline of the Gods. And basically, that was a study of the whole Rh negative blood and how it ties in with the UFO subject and abductions and so on. Now, what I'm going to tell you, that book provided the most feedback that I'd ever got from any book.
Is that right?
It was, yeah, I mean, mostly for any book I tend to write, I probably get sort of, I don't know, 50 or 60 people, over the course of the year that the book's out, will contact me and
Hmm.
say, read your book, enjoyed it, want to share this story. And 50 to 60, it's a fair amount of people, to take time out of their day to do that. I appreciate people doing that. But with Bloodline of the Gods, I think I got somewhere in the region of probably about 300 to 400 emails, messages, Facebook messages or messages to my blog, etc., of people saying either they'd had the experience and were Rh negative, or a family member was, or they had questions for it. But yeah, that book actually provided the most feedback that I'd ever got from any
Wow.
book. So, I find that kind of interesting that, as you said, the more you look into this Rh negative angle, you do find that there's this undercurrent of connections that a lot of people didn't even realize were there in the first place.
It's fascinating. So, Nick, how can people get in contact with you and find your books, and what do you have on the horizon?
Okay. Well, all the books are available on Amazon, and for people who still like to walk in bookstores, about 60% of them you can get off the shelves in Barnes and Noble. People can reach me at various ways. Facebook, just type me in, you'll see me. and there's also Twitter, Nick Redfern UFO, and I have a blog called World of Whatever. So if you just type that in, you'll see the link. And as far as what's coming next, I've actually got one coming out on New Year's Day of all times possible, and it's called Area 51, and it's a 400-page study of the history of Area 51, but focusing on the whole UFO angle and theories and claims connected to it.
Oh, I'm definitely going to read that one. So, Nick, thanks again for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
You take care now.
You too.
Now, listeners can show their support for Arcane Radio by becoming a patron.
Great.
Simply go to phantomsandmonsters.com and click the Podbean patron banner. Arcane Radio also accepts direct donations. Now, if you have an unexplained encounter or sighting, feel free to contact me through the Phantoms and Monsters blog site. I want to again thank Nick Redfern for joining me this evening, and I want to thank you for listening to the show. Now, good night and have a great weekend.